The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast, exploring the mighty worlds of one Robert Jordan, 2 chapters or thereabouts at a time. I am your primary host, Greg, which I think you must recognize by now, and my supremacy will remain. And joining me is the guy who says he knows more than me, but we shall see tonight if we can put that to the test. Tylor. Hello, Tylor.
Hi, you asserting that you are the primary host reminds me of the time when I got one piece of mail that said I was the chair of the economics department, and I never let anyone forget it. So I'm willing to accept the asserted dominance. That is fine with me. It seems like this is the section of the book where I always kind of get worn down by a little bit of the repetitiveness of it. And so I'm excited that you seem to still be really pumped and ready to go at the beginning of every episode. It kind of gets me hyped to keep reading, even though I have a countdown until we get to the good stuff. It's getting small, but I have a countdown.
Fake it till you make it. I mean, yes, I'm very, very excited to continue on our journey. Well, I will say, since we think we're not going to talk that long tonight, all things considered, that I was just on a work trip. I went to a conference in Chicago, and one of the things I try to do when I visit other cities is pop into an independent bookstore just to get a little flavor of the city. And I like to make a purchase because I like to support independent bookstores. And I had a list of like 4 books I wanted, and I went shelf to shelf to shelf, and they didn't have any in stock. So I landed on book 3 of the Wheel of Time series, all but guaranteeing at least a season 3 of this show, because I'm not going to invest $10.99 and then not record a podcast as I read the book.
I would just also like to point out, while we are talking about how you are the more enthusiastic and prepared podcast host, you keep going on social media saying I dragged you into this podcast. I'd like to be very clear. I asked you, you said no, and I was cool with it until you came back. That's all I got, a little bit of social media refutation. Why don't we dive into then a description of chapter 14, Wolfbrother. So this chapter begins with Ingtar and Perrin and Matt just completely baffled about where Rand and Hurin and Loyal could have gone. Ingtar has sent multiple people searching. He says even Uno hasn't seen any signs, and if Uno doesn't see anything, there's probably nothing to see. But Ingtar is so worried, he kind of tells Uno to do a second pass, which it seems from everyone's reaction is not a thing that you typically do. Matt and Perrin suggest to Ingtar that Rand might have run away, and Ingtar asks for a reason why, and they are unable to give him one for obvious reasons. And then B says even if Rand would have run away, what about Loyal and Hurin? Hurin especially would never have abandoned this mission. It seems like Perrin doesn't really have a response to this, and the conversation kind of dies out. And then Perrin, after almost a minute, it seems, says, well, here's a good reason why he could have run away, but there's no one to listen to him. At this point, Perrin realizes that he actually has a solution for their lack of sniffer and reaches out to the wolves, hoping that they will be able to assist him. He is initially surprised that the wolves recognize him and know who he is. He is even more surprised when they have a name for him. It turns out that Perrin is Young Bull in the wolf terminology. Perrin then gives the wolves the scent of Rand and Loyal, and Hurin asks if they have smelt that scent, and they say basically the same thing that Uno said the trail completely dies at the camp last night. And then he gives them the scent of Fane and the Trollocs, and the wolves are able to give him a direction. He then goes and talks to Ingtar and tells him the truth about what is happening. And Ingtar says, people might be unsure about this. I'm okay with it, but others might be worried about it. Why don't we say that you are a sniffer? And this lie seems to actually go over relatively well with all of the Shinarans. They saw his sensitive nose around the dead bodies. Matt seems to be the only one who really pushes back against it. He is in the midst of doing this when Perrin feels a great amount of violence from the wolves and kind of pulls up to a stop. And as they stop, someone behind them then catches up with them. It turns out that this is Varen, who has been following them for some time. She is initially quite shocked that Rand isn't with them, asks after it, and makes it very clear that she is interested in Rand. As they are walking away, she continues to ask after him with Ingtar. So I see this as yet another one of those kind of travel chapters, but one with a mystery that our characters have that we kind of know the answer to, and the reintroduction of what for me is a beloved character. What did you make of this actually pretty short chapter where a lot goes on? You are muted, good sir.
Well, that's all I had to say about that. Sorry, I did mute for a drink of water and forgot.
I just need to say, every time you mute, I think to myself, I'm going to edit this out. And then you have a great joke when you come back and I can't cut it out.
I will say I did this academic conference and we had to Zoom in one of our colleagues because she actually had COVID, so she couldn't travel with us. So I started the conference and I turned it all on and I was like, and let me introduce you all to the technology of Zoom, which you may not be familiar with. And it's a lame conference joke. I expected the like polite chuckles, but I got like fall out of your chair laughter about that. And I'm like, I think this shows how scarred we all are from the last few years. All right. And edit. Perfect. So my first note for this chapter, or let's call it my favorite note, it just says 3 words, let's get wolfy, which I think means I was very excited to see the return of Perrin. I remember from last book that this is a favorite character of yours, and we've had subtle reminders of his powers, but this is like really diving back into them and helping us understand more about him. So by far, that's my favorite thing in this chapter. I'm really excited that this is tied in again. And it even had like some nice sprinkles of things that I really enjoyed last book, like the wolf language and some of the naming system. Yeah. They weren't prominent other than, as you mentioned, him getting his nickname, but it was really nice to just be like, oh yes, we're back in there. It's it's the warm sweater we're pulling on.
Yeah, I love being back in Wolfland. And if we're talking about names, just a couple that I noted that I thought really worked. We had Smoke, Two Deer, and Winter Dawn, all of which don't have full descriptions like Young Bull will, and I'm sure we'll discuss that in more detail. But even just any quick mention of a wolf name, I am immediately drawn to it. Why don't we take this chapter chronologically? So let's jump back a little bit from the wolves. What did you make of what kind of seems to me to be a mystery scene where we might not know the actual answer to the mystery, but we at least know what happened to the 3 characters who are vanished? Did you kind of attach yourself like I did to the 1 or 2 character moments in it, or was there anything else in here that really stood out to you in the initial part of the scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is because we know that they're fine and they're gone, and we don't know the exact reasons, but we understand the kind of mechanic that took them away. It was kind of like, yep, okay, we can kind of skip over this. It's much more about what are these characters going to do in the aftermath of that. And I did, and I think this will transition into what you want to say. I did like the kind of thinking of like Rand wouldn't just do that. Like it doesn't quite make sense to them. And I think that's a good reminder that despite the kind of teenager drama we've seen, they still trust their friend.
Yeah, and I agree with all of that. And I think that this is the only part of the scene that I'm really drawn to is we get a really good glimpse into Perrin's mind in this scene, I feel like, where he is kind of initially torn between, could he have run away? It feels like he wouldn't, but maybe he would. And then Matt starts kind of really pushing the he ran away. And we see Perrin simultaneously kind of back him up and try to defend what Matt is saying, while also internally being like, Matt, do not push this too far. We don't want to have to justify why he might have run away. And then that coupled with the end of the scene being Perrin kind of finally making up his own mind and announcing he probably ran away while no one is still paying attention, I think really shows us this like very thoughtful character who, in moments where he hasn't completely made up his mind, his default is like back up his friends, right? That's kind of what I see in the progression there. And that's a character trait that I really love about Perrin. The fact that he's so deliberate, but he understands if I haven't fully made a decision, I know who to trust. That I think is a good way of approaching things, and one that I admired, especially when I was young and figuring out what should my heuristic be.
I like that a lot. And it just, it's the old adages about like, a family can make fun of their family members like incessantly, but as soon as somebody from outside the family speaks up, it's like, no, we're going to close ranks and we're going to draw together. And I think this is a continuing dynamic of the Two Rivers folk. I've probably even compared it to that before, which is, nice because it's like, yes, let's have our differences, let's bicker, but, really we need to figure out, we need to trust each other, as you just said.
If everyone got the lesson, we need to trust each other, these books would be a whole lot shorter. Let me just tell you that. I think that as we're talking about this kind of portrait of Perrin that we're getting and how he backs up Matt, all of this is kind of being drawn in a way that, at least to me, reads as Perrin being kind of very deliberate and thoughtful. He considers all of the sides of the story. That is actually in direct contrast to what we get at the beginning of the next section of this chapter, which is that the wolves see Perrin as almost a bull in a china shop, right? The image they have of him is a wild bull who is leaping in without looking and is already in the midst of battle. And so it's very interesting to me that we see Perrin being the kind of slowest and most deliberate of the humans in the same scene where we learn that the wolves see him as impetuous and young and not willing to wait or deliberate at all. I think that contrast of Perrin and how different groups see him is really interesting. Did you pick up on that at all, or what thoughts in general did you have about Perrin's name being revealed?
Well, I would say the way you just described it really made me think about how it so resonates with how we're seeing Rand right now, right? And then it's like also Egwene and also, right, Matt. It's like each of them has had this major transition, whether they've fully recognized it or not. And as we see them kind of straddling these two identities, the people around them already assign them one or the other, right? To some, they're still the youngsters they were, and to others, it's no, he is now the Dragon Reborn. He is now the Wolfbrother and Young Bull, or she is now an Aes Sedai. So I do think it's nice that there's that resonance across strands here. I think sometimes when books split up characters, it can get like too much to track. It can get a little crazy, but sometimes I think readers underestimate the power of like, well, let's just show you the same themes in different, it'd be like, let's show you the same melody in different keys. And once we see all those and get that, we can start to feel it all layering together more naturally. It harmonizes. Look at these music metaphors. Yes. All right. And then, I mean, really, truly, I was just excited that he had a name, and this idea that like, oh, he kind of stumbled into the power and is just kind of acting belligerently sounds right. And, when I was camper a long time ago at outdoor summer camp, they always talked about how you wanted to be a deer in the woods and not a moose. And so I kind of went young bull to moose, because the idea of that saying is a deer hops through and avoids everything and you can't even see where they stepped. A moose just crashes through everything because it's huge and it doesn't matter. So with that New Hampshire wisdom, I'll say that's what I was thinking about is he's just crashing in, kind of doing whatever he wants, not caring, as opposed to kind of nimbly going about as maybe a wolf would.
Yeah, and I think that it's very interesting to be thinking about how Perrin kind of leaps in with this wolfiness when so much of what we've been seeing in previous chapters is him being worried about this force and what it's doing to him. And he's clearly kind of very dour and internalized about it. And this just again reads very accurately 18 to 19-year-old, right? I
Mm,
I was someone who I had a couple of skills that I like struggled with when I was young, and I didn't learn them until I was much older. I didn't learn to swim until I was in my teens. I didn't learn to ride a bike until I was in my teens.
mm.
And this right here feels like the most teenage thing in the world, which is to be deathly afraid of something and refuse to ever do it. And then the second you start doing it, go beyond anything you've ever tried before, right? Perrin has
Yeah.
spent a book and a half since meeting Elias avoiding reaching out to wolves. And now not only is he communicating with them, he's doing so over long distances and convincing them not to attack Trollocs. It's a leap forward. And I think that that reads true to me for how people that
Mm.
age kind of develop skills and react to hardship, right? They resist and resist and resist. And then all at once, they are suddenly skilled at it and understand it and accept that they can do it, right? All together.
Yeah, I mean that does sound right. I think of myself, but just also like my students. Like when I pressure them to do a piece of writing, it's like I don't want
Yeah.
to do it, I don't want to do it, the homework's lame. And then when they take that leap, they turn in a draft where you're like, oh my God, you're an amazing writer and you have these skills. You just were afraid. And I've also encountered more and more students in recent years who actually are pretty good, but don't turn in the work because that means they get judged. And I feel like
Yeah.
that's almost what Perrin was doing up until now. It's like I don't want anybody else to judge me, so I'll hold back. But now that he's into it, he's just gonna shock and amaze. And and not to skip too far forward, but then to like conspire with Ingtar for a secret and to keep it hidden and to
Yeah.
come up with a cover story. It's like that is all kind of advanced steps on this same path that I didn't necessarily expect him to want to do.
Yeah. And one last thing before I think we jump forward to Ingtar is actually to tie these two conversations we've been having together, because I think it actually highlights the way that sometimes people can have a view of someone that is only one part of them, but it kind of defines how
Mm.
they see them, right? Because I think if we think about what Perrin is, he is someone who is very slow and very deliberate. And then when he makes up his mind, he is convinced and goes, right?
Mm.
And I think it's very interesting to think that the wolves are only seeing him once he is convinced, right? He only reaches out to the wolves once he has already made the decision, benefits outweigh costs, let's do this. And to the wolves, that looks like impulsive and diving right in. But what it actually is the end of a lot of really slow, deliberate thought that occurs before he's interacting with the wolves at all. And I just think that that kind of how the Shinarans see him versus how the wolves see him, that dichotomy has a lot more to do with what he's showing to different people than it does with actually him being different people around the two groups. I don't know whether there's any value in that insight, but I had it.
I think there is value in that insight, though I don't have a lot to add to it. I think that's really handy. And just while we're talking in this section of the chapter, I will say I was surprised how easily he could communicate the scent, which is
Yeah.
obviously just a specific piece of this kind of thematic resonance we're talking about. But it was like, oh yeah, of course I can just communicate a scent. I'm like, how? Like,
Yeah.
it made me think of the classic stone dorm room thing of like, how do you describe a color to somebody who's blind, right?
Yeah.
And it kind of felt like that. It's like, oh, I'm gonna just describe a scent with my thoughts to you. And
Yeah.
especially with I guess our shared love of the wolf language, it's like, oh, what must that be? How does that kind of how does that impulse appear in his mind,
Yeah.
the thought before it gets translated?
So this actually it sounds like something that ties into one of my favorite recent movies, Arrival, which is
Avatar, the Way of Water. What?
Arrival, which is about
Avatar, the Way of Water. Yep.
which is
Arrival.
about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is that the way that languages are constructed kind of determines how we think and the way that we view the world. And this perfectly fits here, right? If we think about what is
Mm,
wolf language, it's constructed by the things that wolves know and understand the best. It smells. It would make sense that those would be the easiest things to convey.
yeah.
My experience with American Sign Language is that I found it much easier to kind of see words that I wasn't familiar with, and in many cases understand them, because if they were words related to motion, they usually included the motion in them. In the
Mm,
same way that I feel like onomatopoeia works in some languages and not others more effectively, depending on what you're raised with. That kind of changes the way you think how animals sound. So I actually see this as kind of fitting the way that linguistics works in a really interesting way. Wolf language conveying smells easily. That's actually kind of fascinating and fits. I'm actually about a third of the way right now through The Origins of the Wheel of Time by Michael Livingston, which is a nonfiction book about the Wheel of Time. And one of the things he really stresses is that, like Tolkien, Robert Jordan was someone who would just find weird things to get obsessed about and then write
mm.
chapters around those interesting pieces of knowledge he had just learned. And
Oh,
this
cool.
feels like the kind of thing he would have done, right? Do a Tolkien style linguistic deep dive, figure out, oh, wait a minute, how did Saphir Wharf fit around wolves? I wouldn't be shocked if that was a month of his life making that happen.
And I will just say, because I was being a jerk before, Arrival is an awesome movie, and people
It's
should
so good.
definitely
Yeah.
see that. It's really, really wonderful. Um, and I had another thought while you were speaking, but I think it's escaped me now. But I do think, that's what makes a master of fantasy or science fiction. It's like if you have the backstory on the wolf language figured out, maybe only a tenth of it makes it onto the page, but
Yeah.
it informs all your choices, and it works so much better. And I think I heard a podcast once where N.K. Jemisin walked someone through, like, this is how you build a world, and like went through the
Yeah.
steps. And she's obviously a master, just like Robert Jordan and Tolkien and these other people we're talking about. And so it's really wonderful to kind of see the fruits of that yet again. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
if you take the time and do it, then you don't need to, because the other version of that is then people who spell it out all out on the page, and you're like, I
Oh,
don't want to read this. This is too boring. But you just let it be there, but only show the tip of the iceberg, and it's a good balance.
yeah, only once in my life have I played a Dungeons and Dragons game where the beginning of the campaign was like an hour and 15-minute info dump, but that was the only time I will ever do that ever again. Um, Honestly, this is kind of what I've got as far as wolves and Perrin interacting with Ingtar. You mentioned it. I don't really have too much else to say about it. That kind of leaves us with the arrival of Varen, which obviously gets me excited. What
Mm.
was your take on this character's sudden arrival, her explanation for it, and kind of Perrin's read on her immediately keying in on Rand not being there?
Yeah, so as promised last episode, I ran right upstairs after we finished. My wife was already in bed, despite it being like 9:07. And so I
Hard
just
relate.
I just kept reading. And so I read it right away. And we had just, well, I shouldn't say we, I had just predicted that she was chasing Moraine, right? And kind of
Yeah.
a chain. And so the biggest revelation to me here was that, oh, Moraine sent her to here. So
Yeah.
it seemed like yet another example of Moraine being ahead of the events, kind of knew they would lose Rand or had sensed him being lost and immediately sent Varen. But it seems like she would have had to send Varen before Rand disappeared for the timing to work. They were
Yeah.
far enough apart. And so that was intriguing to me, that this is something that could be somehow predicted. Um, and then we knew that Leanne, Le, Leandra,
Leandrin.
Leandrin,
Leandrin. Yeah.
Leandrin had also run off. So then my mind was like, well, did she come this way, or is she still chasing Moraine? And I think if
Yeah.
she had the choice, she would chase Moraine. So I kind of expect her to go that way, not to be here with this group. then the related to that is just that Varen immediately knows about the sniffer. And she's like, "What? Okay,
Yeah.
got it." Like all of those secrets. And I think there's a really nice kind of Ingtar reaction where he says something like, "It's always a bad thing when they know that you've been deceiving them," or something like that. And it was
Yeah.
really nice. So I don't know. Maybe I just accidentally summarized and took everything you wanted to talk about, but those were my reactions to that part.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. The one thing that jumped out to me in what you were discussing is number one, Varen always knows everything all the time. We need to get comfortable with this. But number two is the fact that Moraine sent Varen rings a little bit odd, given that the plan we were told was that Moraine was now going to leave Rand without Aes Sedai influence so that he could finally feel like he was making choices for himself, even though the destination was already chosen for him. And so the fact that it seems like within a week, Moraine more or less changed course and decided that Varen should be here and should be participating. I don't know what changed. I don't know what caused Moraine to need to leave or what have you, but I think there is a little bit of a mystery here in that Moraine had basically told us the plan was no Aes Sedai until he arrives in Ilion. That clearly changed days after that plan was laid out for us. So that's the only kind of other link that I have here beyond the basics that you had kind of laid out. Any thoughts about that possible motivation, or is it still kind of a black box that we need to kind of get a bit more before we can speculate?
I'm gonna not answer my response to what you just said and more stick to what I thought in the moment, which is that I thought this was a clear sign that Rand is going to be gone for a really long time. Because I much more thought of it not as, oh, Moraine decided he would need an Aes Sedai, as Moraine thought the party needed an Aes Sedai because they would be losing Rand. So
Yeah.
that's where I will leave my thoughts, just because that's what I thought in the moment. But now you've made me think, oh, maybe it is that Rand will come back and tie up with them. But I don't know. Maybe we should talk more about that next chapter.
Yeah, let's do it in the next chapter. 15, Kinslayer. So I'll be honest, my notes for this chapter are relatively sparse, I think because it was a little bit of a travel chapter, right? They go places, they see things. So a few big notes that I have. First off, there is a lot of description of what the world that they are now in looks like, right? We are with Rand and Loyal and Hurin in whatever this faded version of reality that they reached through the stone is. It is described as warping as they move in a way that is almost disorienting, and it is also described as having dark burned furrows in the ground. And those are, it seems like many meters long and are pretty regular in shape and size. And it's also just described as everything being kind of drained. They stop for water at one point and it seems to be safe, but it's flat and doesn't actually provide any sort of feeling, if you will. I don't have an end of that sentence in my notes, so I'm going to fill it in. They then arrive and find a tree, and Loyal decides that, it doesn't feel completely full, and so he decides to sing to the tree. Tree singing. Within this, it seems like the tree kind of partially responds to the song, but it doesn't fully kind of do whatever it is that Loyal is looking for. And he seems both kind of satisfied that he was able to bring something, but also a little bit dismayed that he wasn't able to completely bring out whatever he was looking for in the tree. They continue to follow the path that Hurin has been leading them along. At one point, he says there is an enormous amount of violence in one place. He says it feels like hundreds of people were killed. And then eventually they reach a point where he says that the trail almost feels like he is remembering it rather than smelling it immediately. Eventually they make camp, and then there is a sequence that I think, somewhat unclear whether or not it is a dream or Rand is awake, where Baal Zaman seems to enter the camp where the other two are sleeping while Rand is on watch. First, he is taunting Rand using basically the same language we have heard for an entire book and a half. He also comments on the people who are following Rand, so it's clear that he is able to observe them in a way that before he wasn't even aware who was who in these interactions. And he also kind of tempts Rand. He claims that he is going to give him immortality or power if he comes to his side. He basically says, don't waste yourself dying. If you come to me, you can get rewards. If you don't, it's all going to be over anyways. Rand then enters the flame and the void and tries to cling to the light that he finds there. When he does so, Baal-Zaman vanishes more or less immediately, and Rand is left somewhat terrified, not knowing exactly what to do. So I'm sure there were a few details that stood out to you within that chapter, but I found this, I'll be honest, this is one of those chapters that if I were reading it and you weren't here, there might be a little bit of skimming going on. I'm kind of at this point ready to be done with Rand walking through bland landscapes. What was your take on the chapter?
Rand the Bland. Yeah, I think so much of it, I kind of had it in the segments you did as well. The first is just like, let's establish a little more of this world. Again, it is not exactly like the Stranger Things
Yeah.
underneath underworld, but it feels a little like that, right? Like the simulacrum of
Yeah.
where we've been. So both the warping, but then what stood out within that to me was these stripes, because they
Yeah.
run east to west. They have various thicknesses. They can kind of find the ends of them, and all of this is described, and it's all just very strange, right? It didn't really sound like a giant machine could have scored it or something like,
Yeah.
but it is very curious. What it sounded a lot to me was a record, right? Like, with the grooves in a record, which just because we've been dealing so much with wheels and cycles and revolutions, it's like, well, wait, is there something to that? But then, the characters don't seem like they're at all close to figuring out where they are, what's going on. So when I get to a portion like that, I kind of file away those details and I'm like, well, someday we'll get the answers to this. I'm sure it'll be described what it is, and we just have to wait for that.
Yeah,
So this, yeah.
I think it's apt that you kind of immediately jumped to like, could it be machines? Because I think it's worth
Mm.
highlighting that Robert Jordan has been doing a little bit of kind of genre hopping in the past few chapters, right? I feel like we are simultaneously in, students making their way to the school and interacting with new teachers. At the same time, we're dealing with Lovecraftian horror in the form of the Fly flashbacks with some high fantasy and the wolf thing. And now we're in an alternate reality and we don't know what the rules are yet. And I think that that's kind of
Mm.
exciting, especially I'm sure as a first time reader, to be able to say, look, I am somewhere and I have no idea what it is, right? Am I back in time? Am I in the future? Is it sci-fi now? Are we still in Lovecraft land? What is going on here? That I think is what works effectively in the early part of this chapter. The challenge is sometimes if what you want to do is keep people in the dark, that means giving them 20 details, knowing that only a few of them are really important. But once you're then in the second or third reading, you're reading 20 details, knowing that only two or three of them are important. And that's a little bit less exciting.
Yeah, and so much of our current pop culture moment is in multiversal storytelling. And uh yeah, I'm kind of tired of it.
I, I
So
think I mentioned last time multiverses are my kryptonite. I hate them. It is a miracle I enjoyed everything everywhere all at once.
and I want to tread carefully, but I don't think this is at all a spoiler. I think you're gonna just bail on phase 5 and 6 of Marvel because that seems to be all we're going to be doing now
Yeah.
after maybe seeing a movie that came out 2 days ago. Um, so I do think, I mean, this is already pretty clearly established as like an alternate dimension type thing. So I go to, a variant of our world we are used to more than the past or the future of our world. Um, and then to your point about all the different worlds, I think that is exciting. And then the kind of nagging part of me says, well, how much does this all hang together then? Right. Like, if this were something I'd read before, I'd probably be like, yes, and this is how they all fit together. I see those clues. But without
Right.
having necessarily that trust that it all relates, it's hard to know, just like you said, the rules, right? So if
Yeah.
they blow up a bomb here, is it across all the dimensions? Is it just here and all these types of things? So I think I'm sure it will be a slow burn to figuring out all these relationships and how these genres fit together. But I mean, that's why you have 14 books. You got to do a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I think as we're talking about this as a mystery where we're trying to piece things together, the first thing that jumps out to me in this chapter is really standing out as anything other than literal world building of a second world is Loyal singing to the tree. And we get an interesting bit of it seems like partial confirmation. The rules seem to be basically the same here, but it also seems like there's sort of an immutability to the fatedness of whatever this world is. That being said, anytime Loyal is singing to a tree, I almost inevitably find it to be beautifully written and an engaging scene. What was your take on Loyal's approach to the tree song in this alternate reality?
Probably my favorite moment in the chapter. And again, and I did just do a Google while you were talking, the Upside Down, which is of course the name of the other dimension in Stranger Things. I couldn't land on it before. But there's another reference here that made me think of the Upside Down because he uses his powers to create a quarterstaff, a weapon, which is very much against what he has previously said, and suggests that he is so deeply unsettled that he is going to break his principles or move away from his principles in order to protect himself and be prepared. But the part that reminded me again of Stranger Things is there's often like a reward for your aggression and your dark sidiness. And this, they say the land felt like it was glad he made a weapon.
Yeah.
And that to me means we're in a really bad place, right? That
Right.
the land itself seems to be craving violence and aggression, and that coupled with, as you noted, what is smelt almost as a memory, smelled,
Yeah.
yeah.
It depends on if
Then
you're British, I suppose, but
and then I went to, it sounded too much like smelting, like mixing metals together, so it didn't really work for me. So all of that kind of together makes me think we're in just a really bad place, and I'd already kind of had that feeling like we want the characters to get out of here as fast as possible, and I think that was just elevated seeing Loyal respond the way he did.
yeah, and I think that that overlap is really effective, right? Because tying those two scenes together, first seeing Loyal so unsettled that he's even willing to construct a weapon, and then following it up with Hurin being so seemingly unsettled by smelling so much violence and seeing absolutely no sign of it. I think those two things in concert led to me feeling this felt like a little bit of a return to horror for me. I don't know whether that was the vibe you got, but for me, this chapter really read as characters kind of being very unsettled in a way that I always find a little bit uncomfortable as a reader. Like I know that they're going to be okay, but I never like it when my characters are kind of psychologically uneasy. I can deal with them being in danger because I'm not too worried. They have plot armor, but
Right.
this was a little unsettling. I don't know.
Yeah, and that it is Loyal, who just seemed to be a
Yeah.
beacon of good, and like, it is a little rude to call him like a happy dog because he has a consciousness and agency, but he has felt like that kind of like, yeah, I'll just go along. I just want to see stuff. And
Yeah.
that he is now in that kind of psychological danger you're describing, I think is very effective at making that really feel so. It's not the naive boys being afraid. It's somebody who knows a lot about this world
Yeah.
and is kind of a happy-go-lucky guy suddenly being very concerned. That I think is deeply unsettling.
And I think that that is what's interesting to me about Beelzemon arriving, right? Is that he arrives at a moment where Rand is kind of supposed to be the beacon of strength of these three, right? Loyal has kind of always been following Rand. It's clearly not the other way around. Hurin has explicitly made it clear that he has all of his faith in Rand's ability. And so for both of those two characters to have kind of their low moments, as we're saying, and then Beelzemon arrives not to push Rand down, but rather to tempt him, I found that to be an interesting contrast to what we're seeing with the other characters. What was your initial response, other than probably like half disdain for a potential dream sequence to this scene?
Yeah, you nailed it, but they very quickly say like this is not a dream, which
Yeah.
I was like, oh man, I gotta pay attention now. So I thought it was really interesting that when Beelzemon is trying to describe their connections and how they fit together, he goes to the language of chords, which was so much a part of the last confrontation they had. And so, whereas so much of that was about Rand severing cords that ran from Beelzemon into the distance, like
Correct.
not to each other, here we have him reversing that and saying, no, there are cords that bind us together. We are going to continue here. So that plus just the fact that he's immediately calling him Luz Theron, and it's like this is the stage we're at now, and I'm ahead of you, and I know exactly what this is. You can deny it all you want, but I'm gonna just tell you this is who you are now.
Yeah, and I thought so. Luz Theron obviously jumps out. The name of the chapter, I had a big ding when he immediately calls him Kinslayer, because we've seen, Luz Theron's betrayal of his family, and so having that called out, I thought was very interesting. And then the other one that I thought was interesting, we've had many, many times Beelzemon has said, last time, or I have been there the previous time. This, and he's also a few times said like over and over again. This, I think, was the first time he has explicitly referred to 2 cycles ago. He says something like, this wasn't the last time we saw each other, it was the time before, in one of those taunts. And that just immediately pinged for me as being interesting. We've seen kind of the infinity backwards references, and obviously we know that this kind of deep time we have is built around 3,000 years ago in the original dragon, but 2 resurrections back is something I don't think I had seen a reference to previously. So those kind of all specific things pinged for me as being Beelzemon really highlighting things that hadn't been kind of pulled out in previous conversations with him. And that, at least I will say, I'm not a huge fan of this scene, but at least it felt like new information as opposed to pure recap, which sometimes it feels like you get the same Beelzemon dream over and over again.
Well, and it's interesting kind of how many times can we get this same kind of refusal scene? Because it is, I think, at risk of wearing out its welcome, unless, like you say, it kind of gives us a few breadcrumbs or we see it different in another way. So I didn't bump on what you just described. So that's good to know that is kind of a notable difference. The other one to me was and I think I have these details right. So the sword glows and gets heated super hot, which brands Rand with the heron mark that he now carries on his body instead of just on the sword. And my notes say Home Alone, because that's all I could think of. Although I'm disappointed in myself for not saying Raiders of the Lost Ark, because either would work, but
Home Alone is better.
Oh wow. We're just coming
not in terms of movies, just in terms of jokes.
In terms of the content we're creating, yes,
but
I
also
see,
in terms of movies.
Oh, all right. So that was what came to mind, and it seems to me that we have continually seen that the heron blade means something bigger, and it's also, we were talking, I think, at the end of the last book, how there was something different this time, right?
Yeah.
And that it seemed to be the sword. And now you have the sword marking the man.
Yeah.
Both literally, but also to me, that then means there is a part of Rand that is going to still be Rand al'Thor, because this is the sword given to him by his father, not from, so whoever he's becoming, there is now a permanent reminder on his body of who he once was. And, I picturing that cinematically, I see like the final duel and he's just about passed out, giving up, and then his eyes land on his hand and he sees the mark of the heron and could, find new strength within him or something like that. It feels like that's going to be a significant thing to me.
Yeah, and I think as you are talking about Rand's hand being branded and that being a link between him and Tam al'Thor and the 2 rivers, I think the other interesting link that we keep seeing over and over again between Rand and Tam is the flame in the void. And this, in this case, ends up being what allows Rand to banish Beelzemon, right? He reaches to the flame in the void, and once again, he reaches to the light, which I think we are becoming increasingly convinced is saidin, the one power. what was your take on, I think you're exactly right to draw that conclusion about the sword and that branding kind of tying him to who he was. What is your thought about how important the flame and void increasingly seems to be becoming? It seems to be tied to him getting through the portal stone. It seems to be how he banished Baalzamon, and it seems to be his link to the one power. So the fact that that is also tied to Tam,
Yeah.
is that something that you keyed in on at all?
I mean, it certainly is standing out more and more, like you said, just by repetition. And we had that he kind of failed when he was near the stone, right? He was trying to
Yeah.
use it to calm himself and failed. The power overwhelmed him. Whereas here he was successful. So it's again, it's this. I mean, the cliche would be a love-hate relationship with the power. He
Yeah.
desperately wants to not for it to not be true that he needs it or that it's a part of him. And so I think that to me means that he's coming around to accepting this new role, either out of necessity or just over time he's just his defenses are withering.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking in the last chapter about kind of motifs carrying over from character to character, I think
Mm,
Rand and Perrin are kind of going through the same thing, but they're at different points in the struggle, right? Perrin already has and knows how to use the power, and so he's kind of coming to accept it within himself. Rand is kind of struggling, it seems like, both with is this an okay thing or is it as evil as everyone says? At the same time that he is still unable to control and know exactly how to latch on to the power, it still kind of seems to come in fits and starts for him. So I think that is kind of an interesting kind of thematic resonance that we're seeing between the two chapters. This is characters who aren't quite ready to embrace their power fully, the couple chapters. It works.
mhm. Yeah, definitely. And it is just helpful again to kind of keep our place by measuring how each of them is progressing away from who they once were. So that's me saying what you said back to you.
And that's all
Like
I really want out of a podcast. I could do this. You're better, but I'm pretty awesome. Uh, I don't have anything else to say about this chapter. Did you have any last notes or thoughts here?
No, I mean, as an overall kind of remark on these two, I'll just say again, it still feels like we're in this shuffle moment to, change our trajectories. And now I think we're closer. At least these two groups seem set in a pretty clear direction. And I look forward to seeing what starts to happen as the kind of action gears up. Um, I guess a kind of well, in D&D we'd call it metagaming. Is this a meta reading moment? But it's like, oh, well, we're like a third of the way through and we still are like 10% of the way across the continent to this driving point we're all going to. So I start to think, well, okay, we thought this Toman's Head was where this was all heading. Could that be a book away? Could it be a couple books away? So I'm curious to see, well, you know, I as I understood this is that the kind of first three books were kind of conceived as a trilogy in case it didn't work out, like it could all be kind of put away.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see, well, maybe now this is all going to be a little slower than I anticipated, being that we're as far as we are without that happening. But we've also seen in the past, if Robert Jordan wants to yada 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 away a continent, he will. So maybe that'll
Yeah.
be the case.
Yeah, and this was actually going to be where I kind of tried to leave us. Is I was curious about a third of the way through the book, how you thought the beginning of this book compared broadly to the beginning of the Eye of the World, because I feel like the Eye of the World to me starts a little bit slower, but then once it gets going, it kind of picks up the pace very quickly. Whereas the Great Hunt maybe had a little bit more to grab me at the beginning of the section, but then it just kind of stays at a pretty low gear fairly early on. This was my experience with it. Is that also how you've been seeing it? Or I'm just curious your thoughts on the first third of the book overall. Where are you at this point in the
Yeah.
journey?
I think that does describe how I've felt about it. I definitely I still go back to Two Towers, which I'm better with the film than the book, even though I think they do the same thing, which is that the Two Towers, you spend this you like get started, you're like, here's where everybody is, and then it's like, now let's go talk about the horse people, and you spend so long getting used to Rohan, and then you slowly see the folding in of the characters we know, and you understand how they relate. And I think that gives a similar feeling to what you've just described, which is let's start up again. All right, let's slow it down and learn these things. So I think that's kind of my reaction. But so while it wasn't what I expected, I'm not yet feeling frustrated. But I also think sometimes I make the excuse myself that it only feels slow because we're reading 2 chapters a week. And, I suspect this would be true of you is if you were reading this on your own, you would have buzzed through, a bunch of these really quickly and gotten to the action faster. So whether it's fair or not, I think I make the excuse like, oh, it's just how we're reading it, and give Robert Jordan the pass.
Yeah, if it's any indication, the last time I read these books in a really dedicated way, I think I probably, in the time we have taken now, would have read 8 or 9 books. So yeah, this is definitely a series that I think is going to feel a bit slower because of the way we're breaking it up. But I'm also hoping that what we're going to get out of that is then feeling like we've had 2 or 3 reads at the end of it, and we don't feel... I feel like sometimes you finish the first read of a book and it's like, I need to read that again because I don't feel like I'm getting all of the great things at the end of it. Let's bypass that issue at least a little bit. Honestly, I think this leaves us looking forward. Chapter 16 in the Mirror of Darkness and Chapter 17 Choices are coming up next week. As I said, I have a countdown until we really start to get on the uphill trajectory of this book. That countdown is in the single digits. We are getting there, folks. Give it just a little bit more time. Greg, I'm going to leave it to you to take us out of the episode. But I just want to say to everybody, while this is, to me, the last kind of doldrum in this book, I will say it's a single digit countdown until we get to the good stuff. And that good stuff is more or less straight uphill until we get to what I think is the peak of the series. So please hold out with us. It's all coming very, very soon. Greg, take us out of the episode.
And we will see you very, very soon on Through the Glass Columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.